Hello again. The work on manuscript preparation continues as we turn to the discussion section. In this podcast, we'll review the overall purpose of the discussion section, and I'll present to you a skeleton that you can adapt to fit your needs going forward. Not all parts and points will apply to all papers, but the overarching concepts will. Oftentimes, there's great excitement once your research project has completed data collection and you've got something to work with. The trouble is what to do with your data. Interpretation is a tricky business. There are generally 5 tasks that the discussion section needs to address. First, you need to summarize and highlight your important results. Second, you need to place your work in the context of existing work. You need to explain why you can draw the conclusions that you do, and what you can't conclude, and why. Finally, you want to set the stage for future work. There's a sweet spot with respect to the length and level of detail in your discussion section that will take some time for you to get good at. However, 5 tasks suggests that there should be at least 5 paragraphs. In creating the skeleton or framework for your discussion, there are groups of questions that you can ask and answer to help you cover the important parts. Question group 1 could be called the "What did you find out" group. What were your important results and were your hypotheses supported by your data? This typically takes the form of a short summary paragraph at the beginning of the discussion to reorient your reader to what you want them to focus on. This is especially valuable when you've presented a lot of data. The next group of questions focuses on meaning and implication. Once you've reviewed the important findings, you need to interpret them for your reader. This is the part where you need to interpret effect size in the context of clinically important differences. You should also bring up unexpected results with an explanation. Question group 3 relates to how your work fits into the existing context. Critically examine your work in the light of existing work on the topic. You want a focused literature review to compare and contrast with both your study design and your results. If there is divergence between your work and other work, offer potential explanations. Don't get carried away if your work produces results contrary to the mainstream, as it could be due to many things, some of which are statistical oddities. With experience and deeper understanding of the field will come more sophisticated commentary. Question group 4 relates to the power of your findings. Some people consider these questions under the categories of strengths and weaknesses. I propose that it's deeper than that. You must have a set of conclusions arising from your work, but their validity will hinge on the robustness of your study design, the effect sizes, the clinical significance of your effect sizes, and so forth. Time, money, patient flow, ethical research guidelines, and disease incidence will all provide limits to what you could do, and there may be common practical issues that also limit your work. This is the time to defend why you accepted the limitations of your design over the limitations imposed by a different design if there's more than one way to research your question. There may be related questions that you've deliberately omitted from your research design, or conclusions that you'd like to make but you can't based on your data. That should also be kept in mind. After you've summarized, explained, contextualized, and critiqued your work, it's time to state your conclusions. There are 2 errors commonly encountered here. The first is failing to commit to a conclusion of any sort. If you asked a question, there better be an answer of some sort, even if it's that there was no difference observed. The second is ignoring your own data and making conclusions that simply aren't true. An example of this is declaring that your intervention group gets superior results when your stats don't show a significant difference, or if the difference is so small that it won't matter clinically. This happens more often than it should. Remind your reader about how you want them to apply your work and suggest where this research needs to go next. So to summarize, the discussion is for what you found out, what it means, how your work fits in with existing work, how powerful are your findings or conclusions, and what is the take-home message. And now, some pearls. The first pearl is to remember that focus is important. You're not writing a book chapter. Also, don't duplicate large parts of your introduction in your discussion literature review, and vice versa. Succeeding with discussion writing also requires you to understand what your data is saying. This takes time, experience, and discussion, and there may be more than one interpretation. Conversations amongst the research team are critical for achieving the necessary understanding. It makes no sense to discuss how your work fits in with other work if you don't even know what you've got. Flow of ideas is very important in the discussion section. Flight of ideas is a common error in the work of junior authors in poorly revised manuscripts. There are a few ways to structure your flow of ideas depending on what you need to discuss. If your work has one major finding, a linear construct like we've described here is fine. If you have 2 to 3 important points that stand separately from each other, you could also do the first part of the skeleton several times and then complete the final steps. The important point is to finish an idea before moving on to the next. It also highlights the value of having someone else check your manuscript because you may not see your own flight of ideas. Don't make statements that you can't support with your work. This is really important, and I've said it before. Don't go beyond your data. There are a variety of cognitive biases that creep into research, and you must guard against them at all times. If your data says one thing and you conclude another, you've just hamstrung your work. Even worse, if you place your erroneous conclusions in the abstract, you may be inadvertently misrepresenting your research to the wider world. Say what you see, not what you want to see. Just like with the podcast on abstracts, I can't say it often enough that it takes time and multiple revisions to achieve a top-flight discussion section. It is worth the investment up front because a lousy discussion can bury you in revisions or in rejections from a journal, and you may serve to confuse the reader instead of successfully communicating the work that you spent so much time doing. In conclusion, a well-done discussion section will interpret and package your work in an accessible form for readers. This is a skill that has to be practiced and mentored because it does not emerge fully formed. In the next podcast, we'll talk about what happens when your paper gets sent back for revisions.